In the crystalline cities of Luminera, where time held no meaning and death was merely a distant legend, the Eternals had watched the cosmos for millennia. Their alabaster towers pierced the violet skies, monuments to their mastery over mortality itself. Among them, Vesper stood at the observatory, her iridescent form shifting like starlight as she monitored the patterns of the universe. The signal that changed everything came not with a bang but with a whisper, a persistent melody of radio waves from a distant blue planet. Humans, they called themselves. Vesper had observed them for centuries, these brief sparks of consciousness that flared and faded in what seemed like mere moments to her kind. "Another civilization rises," remarked Theron, materializing beside her. His essence rippled with the accumulated wisdom of 50,000 years. "They'll fade like all the others." But something was different about these humans. They didn't just exist, they burned with an intensity that puzzled the Eternals. Despite their laughably short lifespans, they created, destroyed, and rebuilt with a ferocity that defied logic. The High Council of Luminera convened in their Chamber of Light, 12 ancient beings whose very thoughts could reshape reality. Their discussion of humanity's signal lasted what might have been days or years. Time meant little to those who had an infinity of it. "They're fascinating," Vesper argued before the council. "They accomplish more in their brief lives than we do in centuries. Their art, their music, it carries something we've forgotten." "You speak of chaos," countered Archon Lysander, his form a tapestry of shifting constellations. "We achieved perfection eons ago. What could these mayflies teach us?" The debate might have ended there, as most debates did in their unchanging society, but Vesper had prepared something unprecedented. She had recorded human emotions. The chamber filled with projections, a mother's tears of joy at her child's first steps, a painter's frustration as he destroyed his work to begin anew, lovers embracing as if each moment was their last. The council watched in silence as these scenes played out. Some turned away, disturbed by the raw intensity. Others leaned forward, experiencing something they hadn't felt in millennia, curiosity. "They live like this always," Vesper explained. "Every moment matters to them because their moments are finite. They don't have the luxury of endless tomorrows." The revelation sent ripples through the collective consciousness of the Eternals. Small factions began to form, those who wished to study humanity more closely, and those who saw them as a threat to their perfect, unchanging existence. Vesper found herself leading a covert mission to Earth, accompanied by others who shared her fascination. They took human form, their celestial bodies condensed into flesh and bone. The sensation was shocking. Hunger, fatigue, the constant awareness of time passing. They established themselves in a small coastal city, posing as researchers. Vesper, now wearing human flesh, felt the strange push and pull of gravity, the peculiar urgency of a heartbeat. She understood for the first time why humans moved so quickly, spoke so urgently, their bodies themselves were counting down. In their daily observations, they witnessed humanity's perpetual dance with time. People rushed to work, savored meals, argued passionately over seemingly trivial matters. Every action carried weight because every action consumed their precious, limited time. But it was in an unexpected moment that Vesper glimpsed something that would shake the foundations of her eternal existence. She watched an elderly artist teaching his granddaughter to paint, his hands trembling with age but his eyes bright with purpose. Despite his obvious awareness of approaching death, he poured himself into each lesson, each stroke of the brush carrying not despair but hope. "Why do you spend your remaining time this way?" she asked him one day, her human disguise perfect but her understanding still limited. The old man smiled, adding another stroke to their shared canvas. "Because this is how she'll remember me. In her art, a piece of me will live on." Isn't that a kind of immortality worth having? The concept struck Vesper like a physical blow. The Eternals had achieved endless existence, but humans had discovered something perhaps more precious, the ability to live on through their impact on others, through the ripples they created in the vast ocean of existence. As she reported back to her fellow observers, Vesper realized they had stumbled upon something far more significant than simple anthropological curiosity. The humans weren't just surviving despite their mortality, they were drawing strength from it. Their abbreviated lifespans didn't diminish their achievements, they catalyzed them. This understanding began to spread among the observation team, causing subtle but profound changes in their perspective. They found themselves counting days, savoring moments, feeling the weight of choices in a way they never had before. Some even began to experience something entirely new to their kind, regret for time wasted in their eternal existence. As the first phase of their mission drew to a close, Vesper and her team prepared their initial reports for the Council. But how could they convey this revolutionary understanding to beings who had never known the sweet urgency of limited time? The answer, they realized, would have to be as radical as their discovery itself. The fate of two species, one eternal, one ephemeral, hung in the balance of what they would reveal. For the first time in eons, the future was uncertain, and in that uncertainty lay the seeds of change that would shake the foundations of their immortal civilization. The revelation spread through Luminera like ripples in a still pond. The observation team's initial reports triggered unprecedented debate among the Eternals. Vesper's findings had exposed a paradox that challenged their fundamental beliefs about existence. Cassius, an ancient scholar who had spent millennia cataloging the rise and fall of civilizations, emerged from his archives with troubling correlations. Every advanced species they had encountered either achieved immortality and stagnated, or burned briefly but brilliantly before extinction. Humanity alone seemed to maintain its creative spark despite technological advancement. Vesper and her team continued their Earth observations, but now with a new directive: understand the connection between mortality and innovation. They established a research facility in a bustling metropolis, their human disguises allowing them to integrate seamlessly into academic circles. Their breakthrough came through an unlikely source, a hospice center. Here, they witnessed humans facing their mortality with a clarity that stunned the observers. Terminal patients spent their final days creating art, reconciling with loved ones, writing memoirs, or contributing to scientific research they would never see completed. One patient, a quantum physicist named Raina Patel, particularly fascinated them. Despite her declining health, she worked tirelessly on theoretical models of consciousness transfer. "Death isn't the enemy," she told Vesper during one of their conversations. "The real tragedy would be living forever without purpose." The words haunted Vesper. She began noticing patterns in human behavior that had escaped their initial analysis. Humans didn't just create despite their mortality, they created because of it. Their finite existence drove them to leave legacies, to impact the world in ways that would outlive their physical forms. Meanwhile, back in Luminera, the first cracks in their eternal society began to show. Younger Eternals, inspired by the observation team's reports, started questioning their unchanging existence. Some began experimenting with self-imposed limitations, creating art with artificial time constraints, or engaging in activities with engineered risk. The High Council watched these developments with growing concern. Archon Lysander called an emergency session, his form now turbulent with barely contained anxiety. "This fascination with mortality is spreading like a virus," he declared. "We must end the Earth observation project immediately." But it was too late. The knowledge couldn't be contained. Small groups of Eternals had already begun secret experiments, attempting to simulate the human experience of time's passage. They created chambers where time moved differently, spaces where they could experience something akin to mortality. Theron, once skeptical, now led one of these experimental groups. "We've been wrong," he announced during a clandestine meeting. Immortality wasn't the pinnacle of evolution, it was a dead end. We achieved eternal life but lost the very thing that makes life worth living. The debate escalated when a young Eternal named Nova made an unprecedented discovery in the ancient archives. Hidden in forgotten data streams were records of their species' original form, before they had engineered their immortality. They had once been more like humans, living finite but dynamic lives. This revelation shattered the last remnants of complacency among the observation team. They began to see their immortality not as an achievement, but as a chrysalis they had refused to emerge from. While they had preserved their existence indefinitely, they had sacrificed the very essence of living. Vesper found herself drawn back to the hospice center, to conversations with Reyna. The physicist's condition had deteriorated, but her mind remained sharp. "Your people," she said one day, surprising Vesper with her perception, "they're not really living, are they? They're just persisting." The accuracy of the observation stunned Vesper. How had this dying human seen so clearly what had taken her species millennia to begin questioning? She watched as Reyna, with her remaining strength, continued her research, wrote letters to future scientists, and recorded messages for her family. The contrast became impossible to ignore. The Eternals had achieved perfect stability, but humans had mastered something far more valuable. They had learned to create ripples that would travel through time long after they were gone. Their mortality wasn't a weakness, it was the source of their greatest strengths. As the second phase of their mission concluded, Vesper prepared to present these findings to the High Council. But she knew now that mere data wouldn't suffice. They needed to understand what she had learned from Reyna and countless others, that the price of immortality might be too high if it meant sacrificing the urgency that gave life its meaning. The future of both species hung in this balance. The humans, unaware they were being observed, continued their brief but brilliant lives, while the Eternals stood at a crossroads that would determine whether eternal existence was truly the same thing as being alive. The High Council chamber erupted in chaos, a sight unseen in thousands of years. Vesper's presentation had ignited a fundamental divide among the Eternals. Her evidence was irrefutable, their immortality had come at the cost of their evolution, both cultural and biological. Riots broke out in the crystalline cities of Luminera for the first time in recorded history. Young Eternals, led by Nova, demanded access to the mortality simulation chambers. They called themselves the Finites, embracing the very concept their society had sought to eliminate. The simulations revealed startling results. Eternals who experienced artificial mortality showed increased creative output, stronger emotional connections, and more innovative problem-solving abilities. But they also experienced something unexpected: pain, loss, and a new emotion their kind had forgotten: grief. "This is madness," declared Archon Lysander, his form now constantly shifting in agitation. "We cured ourselves of these primitive responses eons ago. Why would we choose to revert?" But his words carried less weight now, as more Eternals began questioning their society's foundations. Theron established underground research facilities where Eternals could experience compressed lifespans. These mortality pods allowed them to live decades in what felt like months, complete with aging simulations and the psychological weight of limited time. The waiting lists grew longer each day. Meanwhile, the observation team on Earth made another crucial discovery. They found that human neural patterns during moments of creation, love, or achievement were remarkably similar to those of Eternals in the mortality pods. The connection between finite existence and intense experience was undeniable. A breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Vesper's team isolated a quantum pattern in human consciousness that seemed to intensify as death approached. They called it the mortality resonance, a frequency that somehow amplified the experience of being alive. But the discovery caused a deeper rift in Eternal society. Conservative factions, led by Lysander, argued that this knowledge threatened their entire civilization. They moved to shut down all Earth observations and mortality research. The conflict escalated from philosophical debate to actual violence, another phenomenon their society had thought long extinct. In the midst of this turmoil, Nova made another shocking discovery in the archives. The process that had granted their species immortality hadn't just stopped death, it had fundamentally altered their capacity for change. Their eternal existence was more akin to stasis than true life. Underground movements began emerging across Luminera. Groups of Eternals secretly developed ways to reactivate their original genetic codes, seeking to restore their ability to age. Others worked on consciousness transfer technologies, inspired by Reyna's research. The cost of these experiments was high. Some Eternals who attempted to restore their mortality disappeared entirely, their consciousness patterns dissolving into nothing. Others experienced partial transformations, trapped between eternal and mortal states. Vesper found herself at the center of this revolution. Her continued observations of humanity had convinced her that the price of immortality, the loss of urgency, passion, and true connection, was too high. But she also understood the fear that drove the conservatives. Death, the turning once invited back into their society, Eternals, could not be easily controlled, successfully completed the first controlled mortality transformation. They chose to live single human-length lifespans, accepting death in exchange for the intensity of truly living. Their experiment sent shockwaves through Eternal society. The transformed Eternals exhibited a vibrancy and creativity that their immortal brethren had forgotten was possible. Their art, music, and scientific discoveries surpassed anything Luminara had produced in millennia. But with this renaissance came the return of loss. The first death of a transformed Eternal, Nova's closest friend, rocked their society to its core. Many had forgotten or never known the sting of permanent separation. The grief rippled through their collective consciousness, awakening long-dormant emotional pathways. As the third phase of this great experiment drew to a close, the Eternals faced a choice that would reshape their civilization: continue in unchanging immortality, or embrace the terrible gift of mortality that humans had unknowingly shown them. The answer, they were beginning to realize, might not be the same for all of them. Perhaps true wisdom lay not in choosing between eternal life and mortality, but in understanding the profound value, and cost, of both paths. The transformation chambers hummed with quantum energies as Vesper prepared for the most daring experiment in eternal history. After months of preparation, she and a select group had decided to fully embrace mortality, not in simulation, but in reality. The process they developed was elegant but dangerous. By reactivating dormant genetic codes and integrating the mortality resonance discovered in humans, they could restore their original mortal state. The catch: it was irreversible. Luminara's society had fractured into three distinct groups: the conservatives who clung to immortality, the moderates who explored mortality through simulations, and the transformers who sought complete conversion. Civil unrest simmered beneath the surface of their once peaceful civilization. Theron, despite his initial support of the research, chose to remain immortal. "We need anchors," he explained to Vesper. "Some must remain eternal to preserve our history, to guide those who choose the mortal path." His words carried the weight of centuries of wisdom. The first full transformation ceremony drew thousands of observers. 100 volunteers would pioneer this return to mortality. Among them was Nova, her determination unwavering despite the loss of her friend in the earlier experiments. The process began with a quantum cascade, visible as waves of iridescent energy flowing through the volunteers' forms. Their eternal bodies began to shift, solidifying into mortal flesh. Many reported sensations they'd forgotten or never known: hunger, fatigue, the rhythmic beating of a heart. But something unexpected occurred during the transformation. As mortality took hold, the volunteers experienced a flood of ancestral memories, echoes of their species' pre-immortal existence. They saw glimpses of a vibrant civilization that had flourished despite, or perhaps because of, its mortal nature. The success of the first transformation sparked a movement. More Eternals stepped forward, ready to trade endless existence for finite but meaningful lives. The waiting lists for transformation chambers grew longer, despite the known risks. The conservative faction, led by Lysander, made one final attempt to stop the transformations. They claimed that embracing mortality was a form of mass suicide, a violation of their species' most sacred principles. The debate raged through the quantum networks that connected their consciousness. But they couldn't deny the evidence. The transformed Eternals displayed levels of innovation and creativity unseen in millennia. Their art carried emotional depths that immortal artists had forgotten how to achieve. Their scientific insights, driven by the urgency of limited time, opened new frontiers of knowledge. Vesper's own transformation became a turning point. As her eternal form gave way to mortality, she experienced an epiphany. The very consciousness patterns that had allowed them to achieve immortality had also trapped them in a state of stasis, unable to truly grow or change. The transformed Eternals began establishing new communities, blending their ancient knowledge with their rediscovered mortality. They built cities that pulsed with life and change, so different from the crystalline perfection of immortal architecture. Their society evolved into a unique hybrid. Immortal Eternals served as living archives and guides, while their mortal brethren pushed the boundaries of achievement and discovery. The tension between permanence and change created a dynamic balance that enriched both groups. But the greatest change was internal. The transformed Eternals learned to value each moment, each connection, each achievement in ways their immortal selves never could. They discovered that the shadow of death didn't diminish their existence, it illuminated it. As the fourth phase of their great experiment unfolded, they began to understand that immortality and mortality each held their own wisdom. The question was no longer which path was superior, but how these two states of being could complement and learn from each other. The price of their transformation was high, but so were its rewards. In choosing mortality, they hadn't just embraced death, they had rediscovered life. A century after the first transformations, Luminara had become unrecognizable. The once static civilization now pulsed with the interplay between eternal and mortal existence. Vesper, now in her final years, had watched this evolution with growing satisfaction. The mortality resonance they discovered in humans had revealed an unexpected truth: death wasn't just an ending, but a catalyst for meaning. The transformed Eternals had achieved more in their limited lifespans than they had in eons of immortality. The Human Observation Project had evolved into an exchange program. Selected humans now worked alongside both mortal and immortal Eternals, sharing their innate understanding of finite existence. The collaboration had produced extraordinary advances in consciousness studies, art, and technology. Raina Patel's consciousness transfer theories, combined with eternal quantum technology, had led to a breakthrough. While they couldn't prevent death, they could preserve the essence of experiences, allowing future generations to learn from those who had passed. It wasn't immortality, but rather a way to ensure that no life's wisdom was entirely lost. The conservative faction, led by Lysander, had eventually found their own role in this new society. As living repositories of history and knowledge, they provided continuity while the mortal Eternals drove change and innovation. The tension between preservation and progress had become a source of strength rather than conflict. Nova's descendants had become leaders in what they called temporal architecture, designing experiences that bridged the gap between mortal and immortal perception. Their work helped immortal Eternals understand the value of finite time while helping transformed Eternals maintain connections to their eternal heritage. But the most profound change was philosophical. The Eternals had discovered that true immortality didn't lie in endless existence, but in the ripples each life created in the fabric of existence. Even those who chose to remain immortal had learned to measure their lives not in years, but in impact. As Vesper approached her own mortality, she gathered both mortal and immortal Eternals to share her final discovery. The quantum patterns they'd observed in human consciousness weren't just about death, they were about transcendence. Each finite life created unique patterns in the universe's consciousness, contributing to a greater whole. The transformed Eternals had proven that choosing mortality wasn't surrendering to death, but embracing the full spectrum of existence. Their limited lifespans had pushed them to explore, create, and connect in ways their immortal selves never could have imagined. The humans, whose brief lives had sparked this revolution, had given the Eternals an unexpected gift. They had shown that the value of life wasn't measured in its duration, but in its depth. The very limitations that the Eternals had sought to overcome had been the source of humanity's greatest strengths. In her final moments, Vesper experienced a clarity that validated their entire journey. The purpose of existence wasn't to defeat death, but to create meaning in its shadow. The Eternals had achieved immortality only to discover that eternal life without change wasn't life at all. Their civilization had found a new equilibrium, a dynamic balance between the wisdom of the eternal and the vibrancy of the mortal. They had learned that true progress came not from conquering death, but from understanding its role in giving life its meaning. As Vesper's consciousness faded, she felt not fear but gratitude. In choosing mortality, she and the others had discovered something greater than eternal life. They had discovered eternal meaning. Their legacy would live on, not in unchanging permanence, but in the endless ripples of change they had set in motion. The story of the Eternals became a testament to a profound truth: immortality wasn't about living forever, but about creating something that would. In the end, humanity's greatest gift to the immortal species hadn't been the secret of mortality, but the understanding that made mortality meaningful.